we also need to recognize that I'll be talking about scientists, but I'm not talking about all scientists. And I don't mean to imply that. I don't mean that they're all the same. And in fact, that's not in any way true, because as an onlooker of society and looking into the scientific world, just like you are, the media and the way they posture themselves, some of the scientists posture themselves, it's almost as if they want you to believe that 99.9% of scientists believe that evolution is true, that God doesn't exist, and the other 0.1% are just kooks. That's actually not true. There are a lot of people that are scientists that don't believe that do believe in God, and they have various ideas about evolution, but we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight as far as what that means. But I wanted to get into just a brief discussion or a brief explanation about science. Science is really just the gathering of knowledge, and in some ways religion can be science. There's all kinds of scientific fields. And I do want you to notice, though, that according to Oxford Dictionary, this is a branch of study which is concerned with a connected body of demonstrated truth or observed facts. Now, those two phrases, those two words, demonstrated and observed, are very important. Because when we're talking about science, we can talk about the broad field of science, or we can get more specific and into the observable world around us, the things that can be demonstrated and can be studied as a result of that. That's how we're getting into the more specific. It doesn't need to contradict religion, however. How many of y'all have heard that science and religion can't mix? Well, good science and good religion go hand in hand. If you properly understand the Bible and you properly understand science, there are no contradictions. There's a little bit of overlap, not much as far as scientists go, as far as giving religious information. They really can't speak anything about those things that are outside the physical realm. But there is some overlap in the religious sense, where the Bible does talk about things that we would consider scientific. It's not a science book, but it certainly talks about things that we could say relate to science. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, we're taught that God created everything in 6 days. Well, there's a scientific statement. However, he also tells us that in creating the trees and the fruit trees and all the plants and the animals even, he says that they can reproduce after their kind. That's a scientific principle. And a law of biogenesis, actually, is what that's called. And so there are places that the Bible will talk about scientific ideas without trying to make it the same terminology. And in every case that the Bible talks about science, it always tells the truth, and it always is accurate if we look into it. So that's what we need to remember. And there are limits to science and what it can do, and there are limits to the scientific method. We're going to talk about the scientific method. We're going to talk about how they approach knowledge, and then we're going to look at a little bit of, perhaps at the end, a little bit about why we would have this kind of problem that we're facing in the world. What motivates some of these people to do some of these things? I want to talk about the scientific method real quick, and these are the basics. There are basically 5 steps for an idea to become a law. We've all heard of different laws, the law of biogenesis and law of thermodynamics, actually 2 of those laws, or maybe 3. There are a lot of different scientific laws, and they're very careful and cautious about what they call a law. Actually, a law is something that has, over time and throughout history, has been demonstrated to be an absolute. There's no concept in a scientist's mind of a law that is absolutely 100% absolute, because that's just not the nature of science. As ironic as that sounds, the idea of having knowledge means that there's always something more you can learn. But these are so firmly established that they call them laws. And the idea that they would actually be contradicted is inconceivable, even though they believe that there's nothing 100%. The law of gravity, for example, is so firmly established that there's not a person on this planet that would dispute it. So there's a process of how those ideas become a law. The first thing is First step is to observe some aspect of the universe. Whatever that is, you may notice a phenomenon. You may notice that your ear wiggles when you do certain things. And some people can wiggle their ears and some people can't. So you notice something about reality. And so you form a hypothesis. That's the next step. You invent a tentative description. You call it a hypothesis that's consistent with what you've observed. You would say, well, I think that I can wiggle my ears and Jody can't because I have magic powers and he doesn't. Well, there's an hypothesis. So once you come up with your hypothesis, then you test that. You actually do that by making predictions. Well, if that's the case, then I should be able to do it at all times to wiggle my ears, and Jody should never be able to do it because he didn't have any magic powers. And so I have an hypothesis here. I'm a special person. I can wiggle my ears by my magic powers, and Jody can't. Based upon that, then, I start doing tests. And I very soon discover that my hypothesis is absolutely wrong. And so what do? I start over. When I finally come up with a hypothesis that matches some things that I can observe to be true in reality, and I can test it somewhat, then it actually steps into the case of being what they call a theory. Once you have a theory, it can be something that is provable and testable, that can be repeatable for other people. You can take the test and do the exact same thing that I did to come up with the same conclusions. And once that process has gone through a long period of time of proving and giving the opportunity to disprove and challenging people to disprove the theory, then it will eventually become accepted in the scientific community as a law. That's very basic, and I think we probably all understand that. There is a problem, we see that in the evolutionary theory, and that is you've probably heard a lot of people going around saying that evolution is now considered a law. It's no longer a theory. Well, there are a lot of problems with that idea. First of all, a theory does take into account a lot of different hypotheses and put them all together, trying to make one big theory out of it. But a theory so large, it's really difficult to say that, yes, we've definitely proven it 100% to be, now we can call this a law. There's no possible way, especially not as long as we've been looking at it. However, we need to understand the nature of a theory. A scientific theory is a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world that is acquired through the scientific method and repeatedly confirmed through observation and experimentation. In other words, that's an important part of this, through observation and through experimentation. Now, we look at the theory of evolution, if we call it that, then we have to be able to say that evolution can be demonstrated and that it can be studied. Actually, neither one of those are the case when you talk about evolution. There's no way that we have no process, we have no way of looking at the evolutionary idea and producing anything about results. The reason that we can't is because supposedly this process takes millions of years or thousands of years to have a change that we can observe. None of us can live that long. And so if we started now, we could perhaps pass this along to future generations. In 1,000 years from now, they can say, okay, we might have noticed a change by now, but you see that violates so many ideas about being observable and testable and provable. It's just not practical. And so really, if you want to go talk about the theory of evolution, you can go backwards and say it's really just a hypothesis. There's no test that we can do to prove. Now, there are some scientists who have come up with some ingenious ways of trying to prove things and trying to prove that evolution is possible. One of them is to use things with a short lifespan, like fruit flies. So they do a lot of testing and experiments, and you can have a lot of generations of fruit flies in just a few years. You can have thousands of generations. And so they do this testing, and when they came up with the idea, I read a paper about it several years ago, and they were so excited about this idea because they were going to be able to prove that at the end of this process, after several years, they're going to be able to come out at the end of this and say, we've had these changes in these fruit flies for all these years, so much so that we have a new species of fly. It's no longer a fruit fly, it's something else. You know what happened after several years of these generations changing and changing and changing, supposedly changing? After all these years and thousands of generations of fruit flies, they were still fruit flies at the end. A fruit fly will always beget a fruit fly. It's just a fact of life. It's a law. It doesn't matter how much time we give it. It's going to happen that way. And that's what we need to remember. Related to that, though, we also recognize, we've all heard of the missing link. And that it's kind of strange that when we talk about the missing link, it's always singular, right? There's a missing link supposedly between us and our ancestor that was supposedly some ape-like creature. And they almost make it sound like there's just one step in between us and them. Actually, there are a whole lot of steps if you were going to say that we evolved from one thing to another. And it's disputed. Well, in fact, it's been proven in many cases that some of the things that they presented have been frauds. But even if you could prove the case that there was something that was prior to us that we evolved out of, you would still have to show the processes of the steps in order to get there. Are a lot of missing links between us and that ancestor. And not only between us and that ancestor, but that ancestor's previous ancestor also had steps. And that previous ancestor's ancestor also had steps. So at every point along the line in this evolutionary history, we should have a lot of steps in between what we actually have now. And that's the point. There are no steps. That's because what has been presented as an evolutionary time chart, a progression of changes over time, is actually not true. It's never been true. It was a theory that people came up with, popularized by Darwin, that is actually completely false. But not only do we have that missing link for us, but every other animal and species of animal on this planet, including not only animals, but also the plants. Every kingdom of living things and organisms would also have all of those steps in between their missing links. And we can't find any of them. Not one missing link has been presented in any case that I'm aware of for any of those things. And it just can't be. So let's delve into this just a little bit deeper. When we say that evolution is wrong, we need to remember that the word evolution can mean two different things. And these scientists, atheistic scientists that are trying to prove evolution, they know that too. They use the words in different ways in order to try to trip people up and trick them into believing that evolution is true. For example, they may walk into a room and say, amoebas turned into man after millions of years. Who of y'all do not believe that? Of course, people will raise their hands and say, do you doubt that evolution is true? And if they say, yes, I doubt evolution is true, the next response is, how do you explain the different races that we have? Or, how do you explain the different types of dogs that we have? You see, those things have changed over time, and we have evidently evolved, so to speak, to have different races. And there are a lot of people that would try to deny such things, but it's the truth. Now, the evolution hasn't been a lesser to greater. That's not the point. The evolution has been that we have changed, but out of all the changes that we've made in the human race, we have short, we have tall, we have black, we have white, we have blonde hair, we have black hair, we have red hair. Out of all those changes that have been made, are any of them in any way considered non-human? They're all humans, right? We just have differences. And so we need to recognize that there is a sense in which evolution is true. We call this microevolution. That is, changes within a species. Macroevolution is a broader range term that has to do with the overall scope. Now the difference is information in the genetic code. You have the genetic code that gives you the color of eyes that you have. It gives you the shape of your face. It in a lot of ways determines your health and different things, how long you'll live in some circumstances. And that's different for all of us to a small degree. We're all a little bit different. That's because we all have a little bit of a genetic difference. But I'll put it this way. I remember talking to, Carla was telling me about when she went to the doctor, and she was talking about one of our children, I think it was Jody, about his shortness. At the time, he was a little bit underdeveloped in his height. And Carla was a little concerned, being a new mother. And so she was talking to him about it, and he said, he's just too short. I'm kind of worried about him. And the doctor looked at her and said, you don't get Dobermans from Chihuahuas. He's short because you're short. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Well, you're not going to get, if you get married and have children, you're not going to get a puppy dog as a child. You're going to get a human being. You will always get a human being. That's the way God established it. That there are changes, however, because your genetic code will mix with someone else's genetic code, and now we have something that's unique and different. That is a human that takes on both characteristics of the parents. That's a lot different than saying we're going to one day wake up and we're going to have something that's a new species that's not human anymore. It's above human or different from human. There's no way that can happen. Because what we're talking about here is, in one instance, we have differences and changes because the information was already in the genetic code. If you, for example, had, if you were both black-headed and you had a child that was red-headed, that's because there was in your genetic code, there was a little sliver of a redhead in there that got out. It's not because something happened that magically a redhead appeared. It was that the genetic code was already there. Somebody in your family line and your lineage had red hair. On the other hand, in order for all these big changes to be made from amoeba to man, to make a human into something else, you're going to have to introduce some things that the human genetic code doesn't have. If you are going to, for example, if you want to make a half dog and half man, you would have to introduce the genetic code from a dog into a human so that you mix them together. You're introducing new information. That is something that cannot happen in the natural world. Yeah, there are people that are doing it artificially, and they're doing all kinds of experiments, but it doesn't happen in the natural world. You can't mix the different kinds of animals, and certainly not with humans. So that's what we need to remember. In fact, we need to remember, I have down here, red hair is a great example. There are some things, and I said redhead earlier, that actually was not the greatest example, because red hair actually comes from a mutated gene. And you have a mutation in the gene that was introduced long ago that said now we have redheads. But and new information can be presented that way, and that's what scientists say. Well, enough mutations will cause a big change, and so if we mutate enough, we won't be a human anymore. That's not true. Because mutations don't actually help us. They usually hurt us, or they're at least neutral. For example, red hair is a genetic mutation. It doesn't help them at all to have red hair. In fact, it probably hurts them a little bit because they get out in the sun and they get burned a little easier. And I also hear that it makes them crave souls because they like to eat souls. That's what I'm told. But redheads are that way because they're genetically, the mutation was there and it was added to the genetic code. And as then we have children, then if the redhead gene is in there, if the circumstances are right, you'll produce a redhead. But that doesn't mean that redhead is not human. There will always be human. So remember that as you go on. Also, you need to remember this. I see a lot of stuff on Facebook about people touting things in the scientific community about what new changes they have created or they have seen, and new ideas that they've come up with that proves that evolution is true. I just recently saw something the other day about a new skeleton they found somewhere, that they're going to take DNA and prove that this was the missing link. And I just dismiss most of that stuff, because most of the things they come up with, they have a big splash, and then later on, if you go back and look some more, they realize that, it was either a fraud or they made a mistake or it wasn't what they thought it was going to be in the first place. I want you to think about this. There's a blog called New Scientist. And this was written on August 30th of 2005, a man named Kurt Kleiner. He was quoting a scientist from Greece named John Ioannidis. He said, "We should accept that most research findings will be refuted." He was talking about research that is being presented as studies, and he says most of the things that we'll find, statistically speaking, will be proven wrong within a matter of years. That's the way we do things. And in fact, that's part of the process of an idea becoming a law. You have to keep proving it, and people will come and they'll disprove it. So now you have to start over. The problem that we run into is we see all the supposed proof, and we never see the retractions that say, oh, we were wrong about that. They don't print that stuff. They print the other stuff that says that we've proven it. However, think about what he said. He went on to say that there are about a 50% chance, that if you went randomly and chose scientific papers, and you looked at the results that they have in their scientific studies, regardless of whether the study was put together well or not, 50% of the time, their conclusions are wrong. How's that for accuracy and putting your faith and trust in the scientific community? And yet they will accept these things and go on with it. Well, let's talk very briefly about, I realize that we're not getting a whole lot of Bible, but that's the nature of this lesson. But I'm going to look at some scriptures here in just a minute. But I want to talk about some of the limitations that are a part of the scientific method. Here's one limitation that have been presented out. This, by the way, you can find on apologeticspress.org. It was a paper written by Bert Thompson, and it's called The Limitations of Science and Its Method. And I want to encourage you to go to apologeticspress.org, and there's a wealth of information there if you've never been there before. First one, it's limited to what can be observed with the five senses. Now think about that for a second. Science is limited to what can be observed with the five senses. We're talking about the existence of God, or we're talking about evolution. Either one. Who has observed a human giving birth to a non-human? Or who has observed a non-human giving birth to a human? Has it ever been observed? It has never happened. So how can science say that we've proven it to happen? How many of us can say that we have looked at one species and saw it give birth to a different kind? It doesn't happen. Now I realize that there are some exceptions to that rule, but as far as like where we get mules and things like this, but we're talking about these genetic markers that will continue to reproduce. These things don't happen. And also we have to observe with our five senses. So if we can't see, touch, feel, hear, or taste it, we can't prove it. And so a scientist that stands up and says, we have proven that evolution is true, they haven't done any such thing. It's impossible to prove that. They can't observe it. They can't test it. And they certainly can't see if it could pass or fail. That's the first limitation. If you apply that to the existence of God, we can see very easily, how can you suggest that you can prove that a God that has no touch, no sight, no taste, no smell, no hearing, that we can observe, how can you possibly prove that you know that He doesn't exist? He's beyond the realm of the material world. What material thing can you do to test, to say, there's proof that God isn't real? There's nothing we can do. And in the same hand, there's nothing we can do scientifically with the five senses to prove beyond doubt that there is a God in heaven. We have to use a little bit more than that, and we all understand that. How many of us can prove that we actually have an emotion? Did you know that there are people in the scientific world, especially a lot of reading I've done in the education world, that believe that you don't actually feel emotions? That you don't have emotions? All they are animalistic responses. There's stimuli, and you respond to it. You're genetically programmed to do that, and you really can't have any choice about it. And so they see it differently. Well, how could you prove that either way? How could you prove that you actually had love for someone, that you felt it? You say, well, I'll go do something. Their response would be, you're programmed to do that. Because when you do good things happen to you. There's all kinds of things that you can say about that. But we need to remember that there's more to finding information and knowledge than simply the five senses. We also need to look at the second one. That is, it's limited to the present tense. You can't observe something or taste something or hear something that happened 1,000 years ago, can you? You can see the results of it, perhaps. You can go to the ruins of a city and prove that a city used to be there, perhaps. But you can't observe that. You can't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt because you weren't there. Same thing with God, same thing with evolution. And if you want to start with that, we can go all the way back to the Big Bang. It's really tough to say how you could observe that. It can't be observed. Another one is, the third one is it's limited in telling us how, but not why. This is a big one we're dealing with the idea, because one of the fundamental questions of life is not how did we get here, it's why did we get here? Why are we here? Science can't even touch why questions. The only thing I can do is talk about how. 4, scientific method is limited in that it is amoral. That is, it doesn't have any morality either way. It can't tell us what's right and wrong. So there has to be more that tells us that. The great debate that Antony Flew and Thomas Warren had back in the 60s here in the Dallas area. The Warren-Flew debate, the great discussion about it, this was a legendary thing, and I've read the book, and I've had other people have watched it on film and video, and Thomas Warren just totally tore this atheist apart. And so he's talking about this. One of the arguments that he made is that Antony Flew was saying, well, he knew that God didn't exist, and he was trying to get Antony Flew to realize and to admit that there's more to information and learning than what can be seen with the 5 senses. So he brought up the scenario with the Jewish treatment during World War II by the Nazis. And he said, was that wrong or right? He said, I can't make a statement about it either way. Now, could you imagine looking at the millions of Jews that were tortured and killed there and saying, I can't say if it's right or wrong? We ought to be able to say it's wrong. But he, in using his logic, so to speak, was taking a step back and saying, I can only ascertain information based upon my 5 senses. He can't come to a conclusion about whether that was right or wrong. There's got to be more to understanding and knowledge than that. And the 5th one is it's limited in that it cannot deal with the unique. Something that happens one time and never happens again. Science can't explain it or even touch it because it can't be reproduced. So let's look over in Romans chapter 1, 19 through 22 or so. We're going to look at, very quickly, considering the source. And this is to help us understand why people would come up with these theories. These theories don't come up because someone sits around and they look at all of the evidence and they see all of these compelling things that forces them to a conclusion that says, hey, I know that evolution is true and I know that there's no such thing as God. And by the way, I have been saying that those are parallel, and they really are. You can't believe in the modern idea of the macroevolution of amoeba to man. You can't believe in that process and still look at the way the Bible teaches and accept God, the God of the Bible. There's no compromise there. It cannot be compromised. There are too many contradictions. And we can talk, that's a completely other subject. But in considering the source, it's not that they're so compelled that they have to admit, well, I don't really like this, but I have to say evolution is true. It has nothing to do with the evidence. So why would they come to this conclusion? It's usually because they don't want to believe in the God of the Bible. Or they've been taught differently and they can't see past their own conclusions. So we're going to look at some concepts here that in many ways we see. Let's start reading in verse 18. It says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image like corruptible man, birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Now, we all are familiar with this passage and how it relates to the Gentiles of the world in which Paul lived, and even prior to that, really. But I want you to notice some characteristics that correspond with what we're seeing today. First of all, we see an intentional disregard of evidence. verses 19 and 20. He says, because what may be known of God is manifested in them. That word known there, as I understand it, is a word of experience. That is, by living life, they have seen and can understand that God is there. They know this. What may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. The word manifest there, it's like a light shining in darkness. It's not something that they just didn't notice. I just happened not to see it. It's been manifest to them, and Paul said that God manifested in them, for God has shown it to them. So we're talking about an intentional disregard for evidence. He says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. They're seen, not obviously with the eyes because it's invisible, but the very fact of the creation should show us that God is there. So we're having an intentional disregard. And there are a lot of reasons people might choose to disregard evidence. You can think of your own, perhaps, but I think of pride. I think of being able to do what you want to do. Aldous Huxley, back in 1966, he acknowledged that he had reasons for not wanting the world to have a meaning, he said. He contended that the philosophy of meaninglessness was liberating for him. He also confessed that the morality of theism interfered with his sexual freedoms. He wanted to not have a God because he wanted to live however he wanted to live, and he wanted anybody telling him different. So he just said, I don't want to believe in God anymore. We can look down on that, but how many of us live that way? We disregard God. We may as well be atheists. We're practically atheists because we dismiss him, but at least he was honest about it, I guess you could say. Others refuse because they're angry at God because of some loss or perceived unfairness. That's something that has always troubled me. If you perceive God to be an uncaring and an unjust God, wouldn't it make a little more sense to try to be on his good side than be on his bad side? But they say, I'm just not going to believe in him anymore, as if I'm going to turn my back, and since I don't see him anymore, he's not there. Well, he's still there. You might as well make the best of it. And of course, the more people learn, the more they realize that God is actually a gracious, good, and loving God. Others refuse because they're angry, all kinds of reasons. And there's plenty of evidence in the created world to prove that there is a God. The laws that scientists say prove there is no God actually prove that he does exist. There's a lot of them. The laws of thermodynamics tell us that there's nothing that can be created or destroyed by anything, any process in the universe. You can't create anything. Now, you can put things together and make something, but you can't create anything. Nobody can. It can't happen in this universe. But the only way it could possibly happen is if someone who was exterior to this universe somehow made it happen. He would also have to be incredibly powerful and intelligent, by the way. We also have the law of biogenesis that says that life can't come from the non-living. In order for evolution to be true, they have to have a start somewhere. Life had to spring from something that wasn't alive. You go to the cemetery and see if has that ever happened. Where you have a dead, inanimate object that comes to life. It doesn't happen. We all know that. But God somehow made it happen. He knows how he did it. We also have the law of causality. That is, every effect has an adequate cause. There's an explanation for it. So there are a lot of other laws that we can look. But that's an intentional disregard of evidence. Another one is intentional suppression of truth. Romans chapter 1, verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That is, in their unrighteousness, they want to suppress the truth, but also in the very fact that they are unrighteous suppresses the truth. And we see that going on today as well. Not only do atheists refuse to accept the evidence, but they also work to promote, to work against the truth being presented. And so we see that in the school systems from time to time. We see it in our society. We see it in all kinds of attacks that are being made. And some of them have made it their life's ambition, it seems like, to try to convince other people that they don't believe in God. In some ways, they are fighting so hard against a God they don't even believe in. It makes you wonder if they really believe. Well, I think they probably do. Another one we have to see here is that an intentional refusal to admit to his glory. Romans chapter 1, verse 21, he says, although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God. They didn't take the time to think about Him and His nature. You know, the greatest minds that we have on this planet, if they would devote themselves to trying to understand and try to perceive and get a grasp of who God is, it could probably help us understand God a little bit better. But we won't even come near to touching the hem of the garment, trying to understand who God is. It's such a worthy effort, though, that we would study the Scriptures and we would apply ourselves to that. Instead of applying ourselves to reasons why we think that He isn't there, we could be just as creative in looking for reasons why He is there and looking at His glory. But they refused to admit His glory, and so their pride prevented them from recognizing the greatness that's there. And the last point here, it also mentions verse 21, is that they were not thankful. They intentionally refused to be thankful to Him. These false religions play a part in atheists refusing to believe in God. We've seen it. You know, Jesus Himself said in John chapter 17, verses 20 and 21, part of His prayer was that all that believe in Him would be one, so that the world would know that You sent Me, He said. There's a lot of religious confusion out in the world. And some people say, well, it's good for us to have that because then you can have your choice of where you want. Never a good thing in the Bible. Jesus prayed for unity. One of the consequences that we're seeing from all the false ideas and the false doctrines that are in the world, there are a lot of people who look at us and say, you can't even agree with yourselves. How is anyone else going to get it? Evidently, God doesn't exist. It gives them an excuse to reject God. It's not a good one, but it is an excuse that they can use. But you think about it, and really all false ideas have these things in common, don't they? Refusal to see truth the way it is, or refusal to see the evidence and consider these things, refusal to put God in the exalted place that He deserves, refusal to be thankful to God. These all have to do with false ideas and false doctrines, whether it be religious ideas or even in the scientific world. It all stems from the way we see reality. So it says a lot about the person. The person that says he believes that the evolutionary theory is true, it says far more about that person than it does about the actual theory itself.